Montana is the fourth largest state in the United States of America. It covers nearly 150,000 square miles of territory, an area larger than Germany, larger than Japan, larger than every country in Western Europe except France. And in the 1970s, the entire state of Montana was home to fewer than 800,000 people. If you spread those people evenly across that land, which of course nobody did, you would have had roughly 5 people per square mile. 5 people per square mile. What that number means in practical terms is space. Extraordinary, almost incomprehensible space. The kind of space that changes people. The kind of space that has been changing people, drawing certain kinds of people toward it, and reshaping them once they arrive. For as long as human beings have been making decisions about where to go, Montana draws people who want to disappear, people who want to reinvent themselves, people for whom the crowded, surveilled, rule-governed world of American cities has become intolerable for reasons that range from the entirely understandable to the deeply criminal. It draws them with its mountains and its prairies and its rivers and its sky, a sky so enormous that first-time visitors sometimes feel, standing under for the first time, a kind of vertigo, as if the ground beneath them is tilted slightly and the world is about to slide them toward the horizon. It draws them, and it keeps them, and in the 1970s, in the years after Vietnam and after Watergate, in the years when America was trying to figure out what it still believed in and coming up short in the finding, Montana drew some particular people. People who had come home from a war, carrying things they couldn't set down. People who had learned, in the jungles of Southeast Asia, that the rules they had grown up with were not the only rules available. People who had come back to find a country that was embarrassed by them, and a government they no longer trusted, and an economy that had less space for them than they had expected. Some of these men found Montana, and some of them found each other. Cascade County sits in the north-central part of the state, where the Rocky Mountains finish their dramatic work and hand the landscape off to the high plains. The county seat is Great Falls, a real city by Montana standards, with 56,000 people in 1978, a hospital, a university, an Air Force base, and a downtown that had seen better decades, but still functioned as a commercial heart region that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. Great Falls sits at the confluence of the Missouri River and the Sun River, and it takes its name from a series of 5 waterfalls on the Missouri. Waterfalls that Lewis and Clark had portage around in 1805, describing them in their journals with a reverence that people who have been traveling through wilderness for months reserve for things that are genuinely, undeniably magnificent. By 1978, the falls were largely obscured by a series of hydroelectric dams. The power was useful. The magnificence was diminished. There was a metaphor in that, somewhere, that the people of Great Falls did not particularly want to dwell on. The economy of Cascade County in the late 1970s rested on 3 things: agriculture, the Air Force Base, and what had been for decades a modest but functional industrial sector centered on copper smelting that was, by the late 70s, in the process of slow and painful decline. The agriculture was cattle and wheat. The base, Malmstrom Air Force Base, home to intercontinental ballistic missiles pointed at the Soviet Union, brought money and people and a particular kind of controlled, institutional energy to the eastern edge of the city. The industrial sector was leaving slowly, the way economic foundations always leave slowly in places like this. Not all at once, but incrementally, plant by plant, job by job, until one day you look around and realize that what was a foundation is now a memory, and the thing that replaced it hasn't arrived yet. Into this landscape, this particular combination of space and isolation and economic uncertainty and military presence, and a specific psychology that results from living your entire life under a sky that dwarfs you, into this landscape, in the mid-1970s came the clubs, the motorcycle clubs. The history of outlaw motorcycle culture in the American West in the 1970s is a long and complicated story that deserves more serious attention than it has typically received. It is a story about what happens to men who have been trained for war and return to peace, about what happens to communities when the economic structures that gave them shape begin to dissolve, about the particular appeal, in a landscape of rules and regulations and institutional authority, of a world organized around brotherhood and loyalty and the kind of simple, physical hierarchy that a motorcycle and a set of colors provides. It is also eventually a story about violence. In Cascade County, Montana, in 1978, the violence had a specific shape and a specific cause and a specific cast of characters. This is that story. The club that would become known as the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club was founded in Great Falls, Montana, in the spring of 1971. It was founded by 7 men, all of them veterans, most of them Vietnam. The founding member, whose name appears first on the original club charter, a handwritten document that would later be entered into evidence in a federal court proceeding, was a man named Douglas Earl Renfrew. Douglas Renfrew was 31 years old in 1971. He had served 2 tours in Vietnam with the 101st Airborne Division, completing his service in 1969 with a chest full of decorations that he kept in a box in the back of a closet and almost never spoke about. He had come home to Great Falls, where he had grown up, the son of a copper smelter worker and a woman who cleaned houses for the families on the west side of town, and found that the Great Falls he had left was largely still the same and that he himself was completely different. He worked briefly at the smelter. He worked briefly at a filling station. He rode his motorcycle, a 1968 Harley-Davidson Electra Glide that he had bought with his separation pay, up and down the highways of Cascade County, burning off something that didn't have a precise name, but that he would later describe, in a recorded interview, as the need to feel like I was still moving, like if I stopped moving, whatever it was that I brought back from over there would catch up to me. Renfrew was not the only man in Great Falls with this feeling. Vietnam returned approximately 58,000 dead and 300,000 wounded to the United States between 1964 and 1975. What returned in terms of psychological damage was larger, much larger, and far harder to quantify. The men who came back from that war came back to a country that was, by the early 1970s, deeply conflicted about the war itself, which made it deeply conflicted about the men who had fought it, which made it deeply inadequate at the work of receiving them and helping them reintegrate. In Cascade County, as in communities across the American West, the men who struggled most were often the ones who had been trained hardest, the ones for whom combat had been not an aberration but a sustained, years-long immersion, the ones who had built their entire identity around a set of skills and a set of relationships, the brotherhood of a unit, the clarity of a mission, the simple organizational logic of rank and command that no longer existed in the civilian world. These men needed somewhere to put what they were carrying. Douglas Renfrew, in the spring of 1971, built somewhere. The original 7 members of the Iron Wolves were Renfrew, his childhood friend and fellow veteran Thomas Wick, a mechanic named Paul Sobieski, who had served with the Marines in the Nong, 2 brothers, Gary and Kevin Lassiter, both veterans, who ran a small auto body shop on the south end of Great Falls, a man named Raymond, who had worked at the smelter for 3 years after his discharge and who had the particular lean, watchful quality of someone who has decided the world cannot surprise him anymore, and a younger man, 23 years old in 1971, named Eddie Voss, who had been medically discharged from the Army in 1970 after an injury that had left him with a permanent limp and a prescription for painkillers that he was, by 1971, filling far more frequently than his doctors intended. These 7 men built something in the spring of 1971. They built it, as these things are built, around shared experience and shared need, around the particular warmth of being in a room with people who understand, without explanation, what you have seen and what it cost you, around motorcycles, which provide, for reasons that people who have never ridden them at speed on an open road sometimes fail to understand, a specific physical sensation of freedom and forward motion that functions, for certain people in certain states, as the closest available approximation of relief. They called themselves the Iron Wolves. They chose a chapter house, a former auto repair shop on the industrial south side of Great Falls, which they leased for $200 a month from an owner who asked few questions. They designed a patch, a gray wolf's head on a black field, with the words Iron Wolves across the top rocker and Montana across the bottom. They drew up rules, which were simple: loyalty to club above all else, no informing, no weakness, no surrender. And in the early years, the first 2 or 3 years, they were largely what they appear to be, a group of veterans finding community, riding together, drinking together, taking care of each other in the practical ways that men in those circumstances take care of each other, showing up when someone's transmission dies, making sure brothers' rent gets paid when work is slow, providing the kind of social infrastructure that the official world had conspicuously failed to provide. But organizations built around loyalty and hierarchy and the rejection of outside authority do not stay simple. They cannot stay simple. The logic of their own structure pushes them, incrementally, toward the kinds of activities that the outside authority they reject would prefer they not engage in. In the Iron Wolves case, this process began in 1973 and accelerated sharply in 1975. By 1973, the club had grown from 7 to 23 members. New members brought new backgrounds, new connections, new needs, and new ideas about how those needs might be met. The original 7, who had built something around brotherhood and healing, even if they would never have used those words, found themselves leading an organization that was becoming something else, something with a harder edge, something more interested in what it could take from the world than in what it could build within itself. The shift was not dramatic. It never is in these things. It was gradual. A member here who had connections to a supplier of stolen motorcycle parts. A decision there to look the other way when one of the brothers was running something across the state line. A slow accumulation of compromises, each one small enough to accept, that added up over time to a transformation. By 1975, the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club was, by the assessment of the Cascade County Sheriff's Department and the Montana Division of Criminal Investigation, a criminal organization. Not exclusively. They were still a motorcycle club, still a brotherhood, still the thing that Douglas Renfrew had built, but also, and increasingly, a criminal enterprise engaged primarily in the trafficking of stolen goods, the distribution of amphetamines, and the kind of enforcement work, the collection of debts, the persuasion of reluctant business owners, that their particular skill set made them well suited for. Douglas Renfrew knew what his club had become. He was not an unintelligent man. He had built it. He could see it. And the account of those who knew him in this period describe a man in a particular kind of internal conflict, a man who believed in what he had originally built, who still felt it as the truest thing in his life, and who had also come to understand that what he had originally built was now funding itself in ways that his original vision had not included and could not quite accommodate. He made his choices. He kept the patch on his back. He told himself, as men in his position typically do, that the brotherhood was real even if the business was complicated, that the good outweighed the bad, that the alternative, which was to be what it had been before 1971, along with what Vietnam had put in him, moving through a world that didn't know what to do with him, was worse. He kept the patch on his back. And he kept riding, before the patch, before the Iron Wolves, before the chapter house and the runs, and the escalating weight of what the club was becoming. There were 7 men, just 7 men, in a city in the middle of the largest state most Americans never think about, trying to figure out what to do with the rest of their lives. It is worth knowing who they were before they were what they became. Thomas Wick had grown up 4 houses down from Douglas Renfrew on the east side of Great Falls. They had known each other since the 3rd grade. They had played on the same little league team. They had gotten into the same trouble and gotten out of it the same ways. With their feet, mostly, which was the available option when you grew up in a neighborhood where the other options were worse. Wick had enlisted in the Army 3 months after Renfrew, in the fall of 1961, at the age of 22. He had served in Korea and then in the early deployments to Vietnam, before Vietnam was called Vietnam in the newspapers, when it was still called an advisory role, and the men being killed in it were being killed quietly enough that the official story remained manageable. He had come home in 1966 with both legs intact, and both hands intact, and most of his hearing, which was more than some. He had come home to Great Falls and worked, for a while, at his uncle's hardware store on 2nd Avenue North. He had been, in those years between his return and the founding of the Iron Wolves, a man who was present in the world, but not quite of it. The quality that Vietnam imposed on certain men, the quality of being there, and also always slightly somewhere else. When Renfrew came to him in the winter of 1971 with the idea, Wick had said yes immediately, not because the idea was obviously good. He wasn't certain of that. But because yes was what Renfrew needed to hear, and what Thomas Wick had always given Douglas Renfrew when he needed it, which was a form of loyalty so old and so automatic that Wick had long since stopped examining it. He said yes in 1971. He was still saying it in various forms in 1978, in 1982, in 1987 when he finally stopped. That kind of loyalty is not easily explained. It is not easily admired, either, when you look at what it enabled, but it was real. It was one of the most real things in the story of the Iron Wolves. And real things deserve to be named, even when they are complicated. Paul Sobieski had come to Great Falls by accident. He was from Milwaukee originally, a second-generation Polish-American whose father had worked the steel mills and expected his son to do the same, and whose son had enlisted in the Marines in 1966 at the age of 22, partly to avoid the mills and partly because he genuinely believed in 1966 that the war in Vietnam was a thing worth fighting. He had come home from Da Nang in 1969 with a belief system that was significantly different from the one he had left with. He had come home believing less in institutions and more in the specific, person-by-person, relationship-by-relationship trust that he had depended on in combat. The kind of trust that military people call unit cohesion, and that civilians, who almost never experience it in the same concentrated form, sometimes find difficult to understand the power of. He had come to Great Falls because his truck had broken down on Interstate 15, 40 miles south of the city, and because a mechanic who fixed it had mentioned that there was work for a man with his skills in Great Falls, and because by that point in his journey, it was 1970, he had been drifting west for 6 months. Great Falls seemed as good a destination as anywhere and better than most. He had stayed because the work was steady. He had stayed because the mountains were visible from the edge of the city on clear days, and Paul Sobieski, it turned out, needed to be able to see something large and stable on the horizon. He had stayed because he met Douglas Renfrew in the fall of 1970 at a bar on the south side of town, and because the conversation they had that evening was the first conversation he had had since coming home that felt like it was actually happening, that felt like two people who were really in the room, rather than two performances of people exchanging the sounds that people exchange. He had stayed. And in the spring of 1971, he had put on the patch. The Lassiter brothers, Gary and Kevin, were from Cascade County themselves, born and raised, sons of a dryland wheat farmer who had worked the same section of land east of Great Falls for 30 years. Their father was still alive when they founded the Iron Wolves. He was not, they made clear, informed of the specifics of what his sons had joined. He knew they had a motorcycle club. He understood clubs as a concept. He did not ask questions, which was the arrangement that worked for all parties. Gary was the practical one. Kevin was the imaginative one. Gary fixed the problem in front of him. Kevin was always thinking about the problem 2 problems ahead of the current one, which made him useful in certain situations and frustrating in others. They argued with the specific frequency and intensity of brothers who spend a great deal of time in the same space, and they had each other's backs with the specific reliability of brothers who have learned that the world provides nothing more dependable than the person who shares your blood. When Kevin died at the Rimrock, Gary Lassiter lost both his brother and his best argument for staying. He sold the shop. He left the state. He took the grief with him. He is still carrying it, wherever he is. Raymond Flood was the hardest of the 7 to know. This is not a judgment. It is a description. He was a man who had decided, at some point before anyone in the Iron Wolves knew him, that the interior of his life was his own business, and that sharing it with anyone, under any circumstances, was a cost he was not willing to pay. He had grown up in eastern Montana, in a small town near Miles City, the son of a cattle rancher. He had served in the Army, the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, in the Central Highlands of Vietnam from 1966 to 1968. He had returned to find his father's ranch sold, his family scattered in the way that families scatter when the thing holding them together stops existing, and the small town near Miles City offering nothing in the way of forward motion. He had made his way to Great Falls for reasons he never explained. He had worked the smelter. He had met Douglas Renfrew through the kind of chain of casual acquaintance that connects people in a city of 50,000 in a way that chains of acquaintance in large cities never quite manage. He had joined the Iron Wolves in the 2nd year, when the club was still small enough that each new member was a significant addition. He had contributed, in the years that followed, the specific value of a man who sees clearly and speaks rarely. When Raymond Flood said something, it was worth hearing, not because he was eloquent. He was not particularly eloquent, but because the low frequency of his speech meant that whatever he chose to say had been, by definition, considered. The daughter who visited his grave years later, who said she felt she hadn't known him, she was right. Most people hadn't known Raymond Flood. He had arranged his life so that they wouldn't. Whether that was wisdom or loss is a question that answers differently depending on the day. Eddie Voss, the youngest, the one who broke. Eddie Voss had been a good person in 1971 by the assessment of everyone who knew him then. He had been funny, quick, dry, the kind of humor that doesn't announce itself, that you catch a beat after the moment and then can't stop laughing. He had been kind in the practical way of men who grew up without much and know that kindness is sometimes the only currency available. He had been, beneath the limp and prescription and the careful way he moved around his own damage, the member of the club that the other members most easily loved. The opioids that the Army had prescribed for his shattered knee were not his fault. They were not his weakness. They were, in the clearest possible terms, the consequence of a wound received in a war that his country had sent him to fight. The dependency that followed was a consequence of inadequate treatment, and an era that did not have the understanding of addiction that has since been developed, painfully, slowly, at enormous cost, in the decade since. None of this excuses what he gave to Carl Denny, but it explains it. And explanation is not the same as absolution, but it is a necessary part of understanding, and understanding is the only thing that might, eventually, prevent the same thing from happening the same way again. Eddie Voss gave Carl Denny information because he was in pain out of money, and because the alternative that Denny offered was the only one visible from where he was standing. He did not think he was destroying the Iron Wolves. He told himself it was small. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself next week would be different. He was wrong on every count. He lived with that wrongness for the rest of his life. He died in 2003 in a care facility in Billings at the age of 55. He had been in poor health for years. He had been, in those last years, sober, genuinely sober, something he achieved in his 40s through a program he attended 3 times a week, and that he described to the people in Wim as the hardest thing he had ever done in his life, which, given what else he had done, was a statement worth taking seriously. Whether the sobriety gave him peace or simply gave him clarity about things he would prefer not to see clearly, that is not something anyone can answer for him. He is buried in Billings. There are no other Iron Wolves names in that cemetery. The Iron Wolves were not alone in Cascade County. They had been, for the first several years of their existence, the only significant motorcycle club operating in the Great Falls area. This was, in the ecology of outlaw motorcycle culture, an unusually comfortable position. It meant no competition, no negotiation, no need to defend territory that was, by virtue of being unchallenged, simply and naturally theirs. That changed in the fall of 1975, when a chapter or club called the Cascade Riders established itself in Great Falls. The Cascade Riders were not a new organization. They had originated in Portland, Oregon in the late 1960s, and by the mid-1970s had chapters in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. Their expansion into Montana, specifically into Great Falls, was a result of a deliberate strategic decision by the club's national leadership, who had identified Cascade County as an underserved market for the kinds of services that outlaw motorcycle clubs in that era typically provided. The Cascade Riders were, by 1975, a more sophisticated criminal organization than the Iron Wolves. More organized, more connected to suppliers and distributors outside Montana, more experienced in the kind of territorial politics that clubs encounter when they operate in proximity to each other. They had been through expansion before. They knew how it worked. The man the Cascade Riders sent to establish their Great Falls chapter was named Victor Pruett. Victor Pruett was 38 years old in 1975. He was originally from Spokane, Washington, where he had grown up in circumstances he described, in the few recorded interviews that exist from this period, as character building, which was his way of saying poor, chaotic, and occasionally violent. He had spent 2 years in the Washington State prison system in the late 1960s on an armed robbery conviction, and it was in prison that he connected with the Cascade Riders, who at that time were running a significant recruiting operation inside the Pacific Northwest Correction System. He was released in 1971. He was patched in, made a full member, in 1972. By 1975, he was a chapter sergeant-at-arms with a reputation among those who knew the riders for being precise, not impulsive, not cruel for the sake of cruelty. Precise. A man who assessed situations carefully and then acted with an economy of violence that was, in its way, more frightening than rage would have been. Pruett arrived in Great Falls in October of 1975 with 4 other riders and a plan. The plan was simple in outline. Establish a presence, identify the existing power structure, and either absorb it or neutralize it. These were the standard options. Absorption was preferable. It meant resources and local knowledge without the mess and expense of open conflict. Neutralization was a fallback. Pruett's first move was to arrange a meeting with Douglas Renfrew. The meeting took place in November of 1975 in a bar on the south side of Great Falls called the High Plains Tap. Both men came with 2 others, enough to demonstrate that neither was coming alone, not enough to suggest that anyone was anticipating immediate violence. The people who were present described it, in later accounts, as a meeting between 2 men who respected each other in the specific way that people respect forces of nature, not warmly, not with any pleasure, but with the clear-eyed acknowledgement that the other person was real and capable and not going to disappear simply because it would be convenient if they did. Renfrew told Pruett that Cascade County was Iron Wolves territory. That had been true for 4 years, and he did not intend for it to change. Pruett told Renfrew that the Cascade Riders had no interest in conflict, that there was enough business in the county for 2 clubs, that a territorial arrangement could be reached that benefited both parties. Renfrew told Pruett that there was not enough territory in Cascade County for 2 clubs. The meeting ended without resolution and without violence. Both men left knowing that one of those things was temporary. To understand the Iron Wolves and the Cascade Riders and what happened between them, you have to understand the city they were fighting over. Great Falls, Montana, in the 1970s, was a city in the middle of a transformation it hadn't entirely agreed to undergo. For most of the 20th century, Great Falls had been defined by 2 things that gave it economic purpose and social identity: the smelter and the base. The Anaconda Copper Mining Company had operated a massive copper reduction plant on the south side of the city, the Boston and Montana smelter, later the Great Falls Reduction Works, that had been the largest employer in Cascade County for decades. It had brought workers from across the region and from as far away as Europe, men who came for the wages and stayed because the mountains were visible on clear days, and because the community that built up around the plant had the specific density of neighborhoods organized around shared labor. The base, Malmstrom Air Force Base, established in its modern form during the Cold War, home to Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles pointed perpetually at the Soviet Union, had brought a different population, military families, military discipline, military money cycling through the local economy in the specific, controlled way that military money cycles. It gave the eastern edge of the city a particular quality, something between a community and an institution, something that operated according to rules more explicit than the rules governing the rest of Great Falls that by the early 1970s. The smelter was in trouble. Environmental regulations. The Clean Air Act of 1970 had set new standards that the aging facilities struggled to meet, and declining copper prices were combining to make the economics of the operation increasingly difficult. The Anaconda Company was studying its options in the way that large companies study options when the options are all bad, and the question is only which one is least bad. Workers who had spent their careers in those buildings, men whose fathers had worked in those buildings, began to feel the specific anxiety of people who sense that the ground beneath them is moving without being able to see the cracks forming. And so the city in the early 1970s was a place dealing quietly and imperfectly with the anxiety of community whose economic identity was being renegotiated. The jobs were mostly still there. But the future felt uncertain in a way it hadn't before, and uncertainty in a working-class community that is always dependent on the stability of a single large employer is not merely an economic condition. It is a psychological one. It changes how people carry themselves. It changes what they trust and what they don't. It changes what seems worth protecting and what seems already lost. Into a city with its own low-grade distress about its own future, came the men returning from Vietnam. They came home to a VA facility that was underfunded and understaffed, as VA facilities were across the country. They came home to a mental health system that did not yet have adequate language for what they were carrying, because a clinical diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder did not officially exist until 1980. And the understanding that preceded the diagnosis was fragmentary and insufficient. They came home to a community that was simultaneously proud of them and uncomfortable around them, that wanted to thank them and also wanted them to be fine. Because if they were fine, then the discomfort of thinking about what they had done and what had been done to them could be put away. They were not fine. Many of them found ways to manage, ways to build lives and spaces available, to carry what they were carrying without letting it consume them, to be functional and even good as parents, as neighbors, as members of their communities, while carrying weights that should have been addressed and weren't. Some of them found Douglas Renfrew's chapter house. And some of those men, in finding it, found the best version of what it offered. The community, the brotherhood, the sense of belonging and purpose that the official world had failed to provide. And some of them also found, in that same chapter house, the other version, the version with the harder edges and the darker business, and the escalating logic of an organization that had outgrown its original purpose. Both versions were real. Both were present at the same time, in the same building, in the same faces. That is what makes the Iron Wolves and the Cascade Riders and the violence that erupted between them so difficult to hold in a simple frame. These were not simply criminals, and they were not simply victims. They were both, and sometimes they were neither, and the story doesn't resolve into something clean at the end. It just stops, the way these things stop, not with resolution, but with exhaustion, and with the specific silence that follows when the people who are doing the fighting are gone or in prison or too old and too tired to continue. Victor Pruett deserves more than a brief description. Not because he deserves sympathy. That is a different question, and not one that could be answered easily or probably should be answered by this account. But because understanding what happened in Cascade County between 1975 and 1978 requires understanding what Victor Pruett was, which requires understanding where he came from and what had made him. He had grown up in Spokane, Washington, in a neighborhood called Hilliard on the north end of the city, a working-class neighborhood, historically tied to the railroad industry, with the specific character of places that were built for one economic purpose and found themselves gradually orphaned as that purpose diminished. His father had worked the railroad yards. His mother had cleaned offices downtown, taking the bus both ways, getting home after dark most nights. Pruett had two older brothers and a younger sister. The older brothers had, by the time Pruett was in high school, established trajectories that were not going to end well. One of them was cycling in and out of county jail. The other was drinking a way that was going to claim him eventually, though not for another 20 years. The younger sister had, through a combination of intelligence and determination, and a teacher at her high school who recognized what she was capable of, gotten herself a scholarship to a state college and gotten out. Pruett had not gotten out. He had stayed in Hilliard, and in 1967, at the age of 20, he had done something stupid and consequential during a robbery that went wrong, and the robbery had landed him in the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. He had been there for 2 years when a man who was already a Cascade Rider had approached him. This is how outlaw motorcycle clubs built themselves in the prison system of the American West in the late 1960s and early 1970s. They identified men with specific qualities, men who were intelligent enough to be useful, hard enough not to be liabilities, and, crucially, sufficiently alienated from the official world's institutions to be genuinely committed to an organization that operated outside those institutions. Victor Pruett met all three criteria. The man who approached him, a rider named Guthrie who was serving 3 years for a weapons charge, described what the club was and what it offered with the specific pitch of a man who has delivered it successfully before. Brotherhood, structure, an economy that operated according to rules Pruett understood better than the rules of the world he had come from. Pruett listened. He asked questions that Guthrie later said impressed him, not because they were hostile questions, but because they were intelligent ones. Questions about how the club actually worked, how decisions were made, what the obligations were in both directions, what happened when someone violated them. He was thinking about it as a system, analyzing it the way an engineer analyzes a mechanism, looking for the points of failure, the dependencies, the weight-bearing elements. What he saw was a system that worked, imperfectly, as all human systems work, but with coherence and an internal logic that the other available systems lacked. And he decided it was worth joining. He was released in 1971. He was patched in 1972. He rose in 3 years to Sergeant at Arms of the Portland chapter, which was a position that reflected both his organizational ability and the specific talent he had discovered in himself during those years. The talent for controlled, precise, calibrated action in situations where less controlled men would have produced unnecessary noise. What Pruett had, fundamentally, was patience. This is rarer than it sounds. In environments where most men operate from emotion, from anger, from fear, from a need for immediate demonstration of dominance that tribal structures require, a man who can wait, who can plan across weeks and months rather than moments, is a man with a significant structural advantage. Pruett's plan for Great Falls was not improvised. It had been developed over months before he arrived, in conversation with the Cascade Riders' national leadership, who had identified Cascade County as worth the investment of a carefully managed expansion. The plan was phased. Phase 1, establish. Phase 2, contest. Phase 3, dominate. He was in Phase 2 when the situation with Eddie Voss accelerated the timeline. The acceleration was not in his plan. Plans in the real world encountered the real world, which has a persistent tendency to refuse to follow plans. What Pruett had built, the infrastructure, the membership, the intelligence operation through Voss and Denny, was real and substantial. But it was not yet sufficient for a direct confrontation with Iron Wolves organization that was still, despite its difficulties, larger and more embedded in the Riders' Great Falls chapter. What the summer of 1978 presented him was not the option he had planned for, but the option that was available. And Pruett, who had always been better at working with what was available than most men in his position, made the decision. He made it quickly once it was clear it needed to be made. He called Portland. He called Idaho. He got the man he needed. And then he waited for the rimrock. What Victor Pruett did not adequately account for, and this in the analysis of people who have studied the Iron Wolves case, was a central miscalculation of his career, was what the rimrock meant to Douglas Renfrew and the men who had been going there every summer since 1972. Pruett understood the Iron Wolves as a criminal organization with military veterans at its core. He understood their operational patterns and their territory and their business relationships and their internal vulnerability in the form of Eddie Voss. He understood them as a force to be overcome, a structure to be dismantled and replaced. What he did not fully understand was that they were also something else, something that the patch and the chapter house and the criminal enterprise were, in a sense, merely the surface of. They were men who had gone through something together, not just the Iron Wolves years, but the years before, the years that had made the Iron Wolves necessary, and who were fighting at the rimrock for something that no ledger, territory, and revenue could fully capture. They were fighting for the only thing many of them had ever fully trusted, and men fighting for that fight differently than men fighting for a business. Pruett had 22 men, and the advantage as a prize, and 3 years of careful planning. And he still did not win cleanly. He walked away from the rimrock with 2 of his men dead, 9 wounded, and his own arm in need of attention. He had not destroyed the Iron Wolves. He had wounded them, badly, perhaps mortally as it turned out. But the morning had not gone the way the plan said it would go. It never does. The 2 years between the meeting at the High Plains Tap and the events of the summer of 1978 were years of escalating tension, carefully managed provocation, and the kind of violence that stays just below the threshold of what law enforcement can effectively respond to. Each side tested the other. Each test was answered. Each answer escalated the next test slightly. It was a process both clubs understood instinctively. Both had been through versions of before in other places with other antagonists, and both conducted it with the specific discipline of organizations that understood the value of not being the one who crossed a line so clearly that the law had no choice but to respond. The first serious incident occurred in March of 1976. Gary Lassiter, one of the original 7 Iron Wolves, the elder of the 2 brothers, who ran the auto body shop on the south end of Great Falls, was beaten outside the shop on a Tuesday evening by 3 men whose faces, he said, he could not identify with certainty. He spent 4 days at Benefice Hospital with 2 broken ribs, a fractured orbital bone, and a concussion that his doctor said was more serious than he was willing to admit. Gary Lassiter did not file a police report. He did not speak to detectives. He told the hospital that he had fallen from a ladder. The Iron Wolves knew what had happened. They responded in May. A Cascade rider named Dennis Haas, a relatively new patch holder, 26 years old, who worked at a truck stop on a highway east of Great Falls, was found unconscious behind the truck stop on a Thursday morning with injuries consistent with having been struck repeatedly with a blunt object. He had 4 broken fingers on his right hand, which struck investigators as precise, deliberate, almost communicative, a message in the language of broken bones. Haas did not speak to investigators either. This pattern, incident, response, silence, repeat, played out across 1976 and into 1977 with a regularity that the Cascade County Sheriff's Department found deeply frustrating and largely powerless to interrupt. Sheriff's Detective Ronald Ames, who was assigned to monitor both clubs during this period, would later describe the situation in a report that has been partially declassified as follows. Both organizations maintain strict internal discipline regarding law enforcement contact. Victims do not cooperate. Witnesses do not exist. The violence is real and escalating, but the evidentiary landscape is essentially barren. We are watching a war being conducted in a language we cannot read. This is, in fact, an accurate description of what was happening. The language of outlaw motorcycle club conflict in this era was not the language of courts and evidence and testimony. It was a language of demonstration and response, of actions that communicated clearly to their intended audience and left nothing for anyone else to interpret or act upon. Douglas Renfrew spent 1976 and 1977 in a state that people who knew him during this period described consistently as control fury. He was not a man who panicked. He was not a man who made decisions quickly or emotionally. He had trained himself, in Vietnam and in the years since, to feel the anger without letting the anger steer, to take the temperature of a situation, and then to act from calculation rather than reaction. But the Cascade Riders were taking things from him. Piece by piece, carefully, with precisely calibrated aggression, they were taking clients and corners and the confidence of men who had built something with him and were now watching be contested in a way it had never been contested before. He held meetings. He planned. He made decisions and then sometimes unmade them and made different ones. He was, in the assessment of Thomas Wick, his oldest friend, the man who had known him since childhood, trying to find a response that would end the contest without escalating into something that could not be contained. Doug didn't want a war, Wick said many years later, in a conversation that he agreed to only under condition of anonymity. He wanted them gone. Those are different things. A war is loud and expensive, and it ends in federal prison or a cemetery. Doug wanted them gone quietly, the way you make something disappear, without anyone being able to say exactly what happened to it. He was looking for that option, right up until the summer of 1978, when it turned out there wasn't one. Victor Pruett, during the same period, was doing what he had been sent to Great Falls to do. He was patient. He was methodical. He was building membership in the Cascade Riders Great Falls chapter, building connections to the club's broader supply network, building relationships with local businessmen and local criminals and local officials who might prove useful. He was, in the terminology of the trade, establishing himself. And he was watching the Iron Wolves with the specific, attentive watchfulness of a man who intends, eventually, to replace what he is watching. Pruett understood something about the Iron Wolves at Renfrew, perhaps did not fully understand about his own club. He understood that an organization built around the personality and history of a single founding member, however strong that member, however deep the loyalty he inspired, was an organization with a single critical vulnerability. Remove the center, and the structure has to find a new one or collapse. Pruett was not planning to remove the center. Not yet. Not in 1976 or 1977. The timing wasn't right, the legal risk was too high, and Pruett was Above all, a man who waited for the right moment. But he was thinking about it. He was thinking about it very carefully. To understand what ignited the summer of 1978, you have to understand Eddie Voss. Eddie Voss was the youngest of the original Seven Iron Wolves. He had been 23 when the club was founded in 1971, which made him 30 in 1978. He was, in those 7 years, the member of the club about whom the most complicated things could be said. He was also, by the spring of 1978, the member of the club who was causing Douglas Renfrew the most serious problems. The Army had discharged Eddie Voss in 1970 after a grenade fragment had torn through his left knee in the Mekong Delta, damaging the joint severely enough that full recovery was not achievable and significant pain was permanent. The prescription for painkillers that accompanied his discharge had been, in the early years, managed reasonably well. By 1974, it was no longer managed. By 1976, Eddie Voss was dependent on opioids in a way that was visible to anyone who spent time around him, which meant it was visible to everyone in the Iron Wolves. Renfrew had addressed it. He had addressed it more than once, with a combination of direct confrontation and practical support that the club's brotherhood ethic demanded. He had paid for 2 separate attempts at treatment, once in 1975, once in 1976, that had each lasted several weeks and produced results that did not hold. By 1977, Renfrew was running out of patience and Eddie Voss was running out of money. And when a man with an addiction runs out of money, the world tends to provide him with options that are worse than the problem he started with. The option that presented itself to Eddie Voss in the fall of 1977 wore the face of a man named Carl Denny. Carl Denny was 32 years old and worked, officially, as a part supplier for a small machine shop on the east side of Great Falls. Unofficially, Carl Denny was a low-level distributor for the Cascade Riders. Not a patch holder, not even a prospect, but what the clubs call a hang-around, a man who did business with them without being fully initiated into the structure. Carl Denny found Eddie Voss. Or rather, Carl Denny was pointed toward Eddie Voss by someone in the Cascade Riders organization who understood that a man with a dependency and a debt was a man whose loyalty was not as fixed as appeared. The conversations between Denny and Voss began, by the account of people who were later interviewed about this period, as simple commercial transactions. Denny could supply what Voss needed. Voss had things Denny wanted, not money initially, but information, the kind of low-grade, operational information that an Iron Wolves patch holder possessed simply by virtue of being a patch holder. Schedules, meeting times, the locations of certain storage facilities, names of certain business relationships. Voss told himself, as people in this position typically tell themselves, that what he was giving away was harmless, that it didn't matter, that it was a cost of getting through another week, and that next week would be different, that IT was not different. By the spring of 1978, Eddie Voss had been providing the Cascade Riders through Carl Denny, who was passing the information upward to Victor Pruett, with a level of intelligence about Iron Wolves operations that significantly accelerated the Riders' ability to undercut and compete with the older club. 3 Iron Wolves shipments were intercepted or disrupted in the first 4 months of 1978 in ways that pointed to someone with inside knowledge. A storage unit was emptied of its contents between one Iron Wolves visit and the next. A meeting between Renfrew and a business associate was interrupted by the arrival of a Cascade Riders contingent who should not have known the meeting was happening. Renfrew started to understand that there was a problem inside his organization. He did not yet understand who the problem was. The discovery came in June of 1978. It came not through any sophisticated investigative process on Renfrew's part, but through the particular kind of bad luck that tends to find people who are doing something they cannot afford to be found doing. Carl Denny, driving home from a meeting with Eddie Voss on the evening of June 14th, was stopped for a broken taillight by a Cascade County Sheriff's deputy. The deputy, during the stop, observed something in the vehicle that led to a more thorough search, which produced items that led to Carl Denny's arrest. Carl Denny was not a man of particular courage. He retained a lawyer and then, through that lawyer, entered into a conversation with the Cascade County Prosecutor's office that resulted in reduced charges in exchange for information. The information Denny provided was about Eddie Voss. The prosecutor's office, Recognizing what they had, passed word through official channels to the Cascade County Sheriff's detective assigned to monitor the motorcycle clubs. Detective Ronald Ames, reading the information Carl Denny had provided, made a decision that, with the benefit of hindsight, can be described as either professional judgment or catastrophic miscalculation, depending on how generously you are inclined to interpret it. Ames decided not to immediately arrest Eddie Voss or to warn the Iron Wolves about what Voss had been doing. He decided, instead, to wait and watch, to see whether the information about Voss could be leveraged into a broader investigation that might produce evidence against both clubs' leadership. The bigger prize, the prize that would mean federal charges and meaningful sentences rather than the local misdemeanor cycle that had consumed years of his career. He waited. The information about Eddie Voss made its way, through channels that Detective Ames would not fully understand until much later, to a different destination. It made its way to Victor Pruett. Victor Pruett received the information that Carl Denny's arrest had exposed his intelligence source within the Iron Wolves. He received it within 48 hours of the arrest. He considered his options. Denny was compromised. The information channel through Voss was compromised. More importantly, and this was the part that required careful thought, the Iron Wolves were about to discover that they had been penetrated. When they discovered it, two things would happen. First, they would know how much information had been passed and could audit the damage. Second, and more relevant to Pruett's calculations, they would respond. They would respond with everything they had. Pruett had been in Cascade County for 3 years. He had been building, carefully and patiently, toward a position of dominance. He was not there yet. The Iron Wolves were still larger, still more deeply embedded in the local landscape, still more trusted by the suppliers and the buyers, and the network of relationships that constituted the real infrastructure of what both clubs were doing. An all-out confrontation, now, on the Iron Wolves' terms, in the Iron Wolves' territory, was not what Pruett wanted, but an all-out confrontation on his terms, initiated by him at a time of his choosing, before the Iron Wolves had fully processed what had happened and organized their response. That was a different calculation. He picked up the phone. He called his chapter sergeant-at-arms. He said, "Get everyone together. We're moving." The Iron Wolves had a tradition. Every year, on the 4th of July weekend, the club rode to a stretch of land in the Highwood Mountains east of Great Falls, a place locals call the Rimrock, a long outcropping of sandstone cliffs above a creek valley that in summer was cool and green and far enough from the city to feel, for a few days, like the world was simpler than it was. They had been doing this ride since 1972. It was, in the life of the club, one of the fixed points of the year. The members looked forward to it. Their families, wives, children, the wider community of people attached to the Iron Wolves, sometimes came. It was 3 days of camping and riding, and the particular kind of fellowship that organizations like this one live for. In 1978, Renfrew debated whether to hold the Rimrock ride. He knew, by early July, that something had been wrong. He did not yet know the specifics of what Eddie Voss had done. He knew that the club had been compromised in some way. The pattern of disruptions made that clear enough. And he knew that the Cascade Riders were aware of things they should not have been aware of. Thomas Wick counseled caution, told Renfrew that gathering the entire club in a remote location, 3 days before anyone had found out what the actual vulnerability was, felt like poor risk management. Renfrew overruled him. He overruled him for reasons that he would later, in the one extended conversation he agreed to with an investigator, articulate with a clarity that, given what followed, carries particular weight. He said, "The riders were making us afraid to do the things we had always done. And if I let them make us afraid, I might as well hand them the keys and let them drive. I was not going to let them take the Rimrock from us. I was not going to let them take anything else." The Iron Wolves rode the Rimrock on Friday, July 1st, 1978. 26 members made the ride. 3 others were absent for various reasons: illness, a family obligation, a work commitment that couldn't be moved. The convoy left the chapter house on the south side of Great Falls at 10 in the morning, rode through the city and out onto the highway heading east, and then turned north toward the Highwood Mountains on a county road that gradually shed its pavement and became gravel, and then became the 2-track dirt road that wound up through the lower foothills to the Rimrock camp. It was a beautiful day. People who were there have said this consistently, in the way that people mention the weather on days when terrible things happen, as if the beauty of the morning was itself a kind of cruelty in retrospect. The sky was enormous and blue and absolutely clear. The mountains were green. The smell of pine and sage and the particular clean smell of mountain air at altitude was in everything. They set up camp in the flat ground below the sandstone cliffs. They built fires. They opened coolers. Children who had come with their fathers ran in the creek. And for most of Friday and for most of Saturday, it was what it had always been. On Saturday evening, July 2nd, Douglas Renfrew found out about Eddie Voss. He found out because one of the Iron Wolves, a member named Carter Blaine, who worked in vehicle recovery and who had connections throughout the county, had heard, through a chain of sources that Renfrew never fully traced, about Carl Denny's arrest and what Denny had told the prosecutor's office. Carter Blaine drove up the mountain to the Rimrock on Saturday afternoon and asked to speak to Renfrew privately. The conversation was short. Renfrew came back from it with a face that Thomas Wick, who was watching, described as a face he had after Hugh City. The face where everything had been decided and the decision was not a good one, but it was the only one available. Renfrew found Eddie Voss at the camp. He did not confront him there, in front of everyone. He waited until after dark. He asked Voss to walk with him. They walked away from the camp toward the creek, away from the firelight. What happened at the creek between those two men, in the dark on the evening of July 2nd, 1978, produced a result that multiple witnesses heard, a sound from the direction of the creek, that those witnesses described variously as a cry, a shout, and in one account, something that didn't sound like either of those things. Eddie Voss was found by the creek the following morning. He was alive. He had injuries that were serious enough to require hospitalization, and that produced, eventually, a legal proceeding and a conviction. He never, in any subsequent legal or investigative context, said what Renfrew had said to him or done to him at the creek. He maintained, consistently, that he did not remember clearly. Douglas Renfrew, for his part, returned to the camp after the creek and did not speak about what had happened until law enforcement specifically asked him about it months later. What Douglas Renfrew did not know, on the night of July 2nd, 1978, as he dealt with Eddie Voss at the creek, while the rest of the club sat around their fires in the Highwood Mountains, what he did not know was that Victor Pruett already knew where they were. Pruett had known about the Rimrock tradition since the previous year, when a rider's prospect who worked at a gas station on the highway east of Great Falls had noticed the Iron Wolves convoy heading toward the Highwood Mountains on a 4th of July weekend and had mentioned it to the chapter. It was the kind of information that went into a file and waited. In the summer of 1978, with everything accelerating, with the intelligence channel through Voss about to be closed, with a confrontation that had been building for 3 years approaching its inevitable moment, the Rimrock information came out of the file. Pruett made calls. He called the Portland chapter. He called the Idaho chapter. He requested support bodies, specifically men who were not known in Cascade County, and who would therefore not be identified when the situation resolved itself. He received 14 men from outside Montana. Combined with his Great Falls chapter, he had, by the evening of July 2nd, 22 men at his disposal. He drove them up into the Highwood Mountains in 4 trucks. They parked on the county road, below the Rimrock, in the dark. They waited for morning. The morning of July 3rd, 1978 began as the previous morning had. Fires rebuilt from coals. Coffee made in the camping way. Grounds thrown directly into boiling water and left to sink. The sound of the creek and the birds and the wind in the pines on the slope above the camp. Thomas Wick was the first person in the Iron Wolves camp to see them coming. He was standing at the edge of the camp, facing downhill, holding his coffee, watching the light change on the lower slope. He saw the movement in the trees below, the dark shapes of men moving to the pines, spread out, not in a group, moving the way men move when they are trying not to be seen until they are close enough that being seen no longer matters. He said later that the first thing he felt was not fear. He said the first thing he felt was a kind of recognition, like I'd seen this before, which I had, which most of us had. He shouted a warning. What followed at the Rimrock camp on the morning of July 3rd, 1978, was, by any description, a battle. It lasted approximately 25 minutes. 25 minutes is both a very short time and an extraordinarily long time, depending on what is happening in it. In those 25 minutes, the Cascade Riders, 22 men with the advantage of surprise, of planning, of numbers, and the Iron Wolves, 26 men with the advantage of terrain knowledge and the specific ferocity of men defending a place that mattered to them, fought with the weapons that were available to them. Those weapons included firearms. They included knives. They included hands and boots and whatever the immediate environment provided, which in a campsite in the Highwood Mountains included tools, cast iron cookware, lengths of firewood, and, in at least one documented instance, a motorcycle chain. The women and children present. There were 4 children at the camp, ranging in age from 6 to 12, whose fathers had brought them for weekend, were moved to the creek bed by Thomas Wick in the first minutes of fighting. This act of specific, deliberate protectiveness, in the middle of everything else that was happening, is one of the details that people who have studied this case remember most clearly. That in the midst of organized, premeditated violence, a man stopped to make sure the children were away from it. When it was over, when the shooting stopped and the Cascade Riders withdrew down the slope toward their trucks, taking their injured with them, the reckoning began. 3 Iron Wolves were dead. Paul Sobieski, the mechanic from Da Nang, one of the original 7, was dead. Kevin Lassiter, the younger of the 2 brothers, who with his brother Gary had built the auto body shop that had been part of the Iron Wolves' life since the beginning, was dead. Raymond Flood, the lean, watchful man who had decided the world could not surprise him, who had worked the smelter for 3 years after his discharge and brought that watchfulness into the club, was dead. 7 other Iron Wolves were wounded, 2 of them seriously enough to require hospitalization and extended recovery. On the Cascade Riders' side, 2 men were dead, 9 were wounded. Victor Pruett himself had been shot in the arm, not life-threatening, but requiring medical attention that he received, not at a hospital, but at an undisclosed location from a doctor whose identity was never established by law enforcement. Douglas Renfrew had not been killed. He had been in the fight. He had wounds, a knife wound along his left forearm, documented later, and bruising consistent with blunt force trauma in multiple locations. He had fought, by every account of those who were present, with the specific, controlled ferocity that people who knew him had expected and people who didn't know him had underestimated. He stood in the camp when the Cascade Riders had gone. He stood there in the morning light among the wreckage of the camp and the wreckage of his people, and he looked at what 3 years of tension and 1 morning of violence had produced. Thomas Wick, who was standing nearby, said that Renfrew did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "Get everyone together. We need to get off this mountain." That was all he said. While the Cascade County Sheriff Department was driving up into the Highwood Mountains on the morning of July 3rd, 1978, the city of Great Falls was waking up to its 4th of July weekend. People were making breakfast. Children were asking about fireworks. The streets that would later be lined with parade watchers were still quiet, the American flags that had been hung on storefronts and light poles overnight moving slightly in the morning air off the mountains. It was a Sunday. It was a holiday weekend. It was, in the way of holiday weekends in a mid-sized city in a large state, a morning of specific, unhurried pleasantness. And 12 miles into the Highwood Mountains, 5 men were dead or dying, and the rest were walking away from what they had done and what had been done to them, and nobody in the pancake restaurants and the church parking lots of Great Falls knew yet what had happened. They would find out gradually, the way news travels in the city before the internet made the travel instantaneous. First, the people with connections, the people who knew members of either club, who got calls on Sunday afternoon from men, trying to figure out where to go and what to do. Then the wider circles, the neighbors and the co-workers, and the people who had heard something without knowing exactly what. Then, by Monday, the newspaper, the Great Falls Tribune running a front-page story that was factually sparse and atmospheric in the way of newspaper stories, written quickly from incomplete information. The community response was, broadly, the ambivalent response of community that had been willfully not looking at something for years and now had to look at it directly. There was outrage, real outrage, from real people who felt that their mountains had been violated. that a place they hiked and camped and hunted had been turned into a killing ground by people who had treated the landscape as simply the most convenient available space for a conflict that belonged, in the community's estimation, somewhere else, somewhere they didn't have to see it. There was also, less loudly, the more complicated response of people who had some understanding of who the Iron Wolves were and what they had come from. Veterans groups in Great Falls, and there were strong veterans communities in the city with an active Air Force base, found themselves in the uncomfortable position of the Rimrock, forcing them to confront, publicly, a community that had grown up around men with whom they had significant shared experience but had made profoundly different choices. The funerals for Paul Sobieski, Kevin Lassiter, and Raymond Flood were held the following week. They were quiet, small funerals, attended by the people who had been part of the Iron Wolves world, and by family members who came from wherever they had been. Milwaukee for Sobieski's sister, the eastern part of the state for people connected to the Lassiters and the Flood. They were not public events. The men who had known the dead came and stood, and said what they could say, and left. The city of Great Falls mostly did not attend. The 4th of July parade went ahead as planned on Monday, July 4th, 1978. The bicentennial had been the previous year. The big celebration, the nationwide marking of 200 years. But communities across Montana still marked the 4th with the traditional parades, and Great Falls was no exception. Floats and bands and children on bicycles decorated with crepe paper and flags along the parade route. Douglas Renfrew was not there. He was, by that point, talking to lawyers and dealing with a specific logistical nightmare of a club that had just lost 3 members and had 7 more in need of medical attention that they were trying to obtain without attracting official notice. Victor Pruett was not there either. He was somewhere in Cascade County, his arm in an improvised dressing, making calls, managing the damage, constructing the version of events that he and his organization would present when law enforcement came, as it inevitably would. The city marched its parade. Flags flew, children waved, and somewhere in the logistics of that ordinary holiday, a line had been crossed that nobody had stood at and marked, the line between a conflict that the city could look away from and one that it couldn't, the line between the margins and the center, between something that happened to people you didn't know and something that had happened in the mountains you thought of as yours. The city had crossed that line and would spend the next several years, through the investigation and the federal case and the trials and the sentences, slowly deciding what it thought about everything it had allowed itself not to see. The FBI field office in Helena opened its investigation into the Rimrock incident in August of 1978, 6 weeks after the event. The decision to take federal jurisdiction was driven by several factors that converged to make a federal case both possible and, from the perspective of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Montana, desirable. The Cascade Riders were an interstate organization, with members from Oregon and Idaho having participated in the Rimrock. This interstate element brought the situation within federal racketeering statutes. Specifically, the Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, which had been enacted in 1970 and which, by the late 1970s, federal prosecutors were beginning to apply to organized criminal enterprises with increasing sophistication. The FBI agent assigned to lead the investigation was a woman named Margaret Calhoun, 34 years old, who had been with the Bureau for 9 years and who had spent the previous 3 working organized crime cases out of the Helena field office. She was, by the accounts of colleagues and prosecutors who worked with her on the Rimrock case, a methodical and exceptionally patient investigator, qualities that the Rimrock case, with its wall of silence and its paper-thin evidentiary trail, required in abundance. Agent Calhoun's approach to the case was, by necessity, indirect. She could not interview witnesses who would cooperate. She could not build a case on testimony that no one would provide. What she could do, and what she did, over the better part of 2 years, was build a picture from the available records. Financial records, phone records, incorporation documents, property transactions, the paper trail that even the most careful criminal organizations leave behind because the modern world requires a certain amount of documentation to function in at all. What she found, over those 2 years, was a network of entities, businesses, properties, accounts, that connected Victor Pruett and the Cascade Riders organization to a range of activities in Cascade County and beyond. The connection was not always clean. It was rarely clean, but it was consistent and it was voluminous, and by 1980, when the federal grand jury began hearing evidence, Agent Calhoun had built something that the U.S. Attorney's Office believed was sufficient for indictment. She had also found, in the financial records of the Iron Wolves' various business interests, material sufficient to support racketeering charges against Douglas Renfrew. This was, in the moral accounting of the investigation, the most uncomfortable part. The Iron Wolves had been the victims of the Rimrock in the most direct sense. 3 of their men were dead, and the attack had been planned and executed by the Cascade Riders. But the investigation of what had happened necessarily led to what had been happening for years before it. And what had been happening for years before it included the Iron Wolves' own participation in the criminal economy of Cascade County. Agent Calhoun, in a statement she made many years later in the context of a journalism project, addressed this directly. She said, "We didn't indict Renfrew to punish him for being a victim. We indicted Renfrew because the investigation showed he had been running a criminal enterprise. Those are separate things. A person can be both a victim and a perpetrator. The law doesn't require you to be only one or the other. This is legally correct. Whether it is entirely satisfying as a moral proposition is a different question. It is the question that people who study this case most consistently find themselves unable to resolve to their own satisfaction." The grand jury process ran from 1980 to early 1981. The indictments were issued in March of 1981. Victor Pruett and 4 named Cascade Riders on racketeering, conspiracy, and murder charges. Douglas Renfrew on racketeering and assault charges. 2 other Iron Wolves on racketeering charges. The murder charges against Pruett presented the most significant legal challenge, because establishing that Pruett had personally ordered the deaths of specific individuals, rather than having planned and financed an operation in which those deaths occurred, required a level of documentary or testimonial evidence that the investigation had not been able to fully obtain. The prosecutors debated the strength of their case in internal memoranda that have since been partially released through Freedom of Information requests. One memorandum, written by an assistant U.S. attorney, reads in relevant part, "The murder counts against Pruett are supported by circumstantial evidence sufficient to survive a directed verdict motion, but may not be sufficient to meet the jury's beyond a reasonable doubt standard given complete absence of testimonial support. Recommend proceeding but managing expectations." The expectation that was managed was the murder conviction. Pruett was acquitted of murder. He was convicted of racketeering and conspiracy. He went to federal prison for 12 years. He walked out of that prison in 1994, having served his time and having never, in any proceeding or investigation, told anyone anything that was not in his interest to tell. That, too, was characteristic. That, too, was Victor Pruett. The Cascade County Sheriff's Department received the first calls about the Rimrock incident at approximately 9:15 a.m. on July 3, 1978. The calls did not come from anyone at the camp. They came from a rancher whose property adjoined the Highwood Mountains recreation area, who had heard what he described as sustained gunfire, not hunting, not target shooting. Something else beginning at approximately 7 o'clock in the morning. Deputies arrived at the Rimrock camp at 10:40 a.m. They found a campsite that looked, in the words of the first deputy on scene, like the aftermath of a battle, which was precisely what it was. They found 3 dead men. They found evidence of extensive violence across the campsite. They found shell casings from multiple calibers of firearm. They found 7 Iron Wolves still on the scene, some of them wounded, all of them silent. Detective Ronald Ames arrived at 11:30 a.m. and took charge of the scene. What he found there and what his subsequent investigation produced told him a great deal about what had happened and almost nothing, in the evidentiary sense, that he could use. The Iron Wolves, as an organization, did not cooperate with law enforcement. This was not a policy decision made in the aftermath of the Rimrock. It was a foundational principle of the club that predated the Cascade Riders by years, that had been written, in spirit if not in exact language, into the original charter that Douglas Renfrew had drafted in 1971. You did not speak to law enforcement. You did not provide information. You handled your affairs internally. What this meant in practice, for Detective Ames and the team he assembled in the weeks following the Rimrock, was that he was investigating a triple homicide, and, in the Cascade Riders case, a double homicide, since 2 of the riders had died either at the camp or shortly after, with a witness pool that was either absent, uncooperative, or actively hostile to the investigation. Medical records for wounded riders, sought through subpoena, revealed the existence of injuries consistent with the rimrock, but produced no testimony. Forensic evidence from the scene established the identities of the dead and the approximate geometry of some of the violence. But without testimony to contextualize it, the evidence told a story with no names attached to the actions. What Detective Ames did eventually obtain was not testimony from participants, but something in some ways more useful: financial records, phone records, and the records of transaction involving a property in Cascade County that connected Victor Pruett to the planning and financing of what happened at the Rimrock. These records formed the basis of a federal investigation. The FBI field office in Helena took jurisdiction in August of 1978, given the interstate nature of the Cascade Riders organization and the involvement of members from Oregon and Idaho that would eventually produce indictments in 1980. The indictments charged Victor Pruett with racketeering, conspiracy, and 2 counts of murder for the deaths of Paul Sobieski and Kevin Lassiter, for whom the government was able to establish a chain of command and decision-making that led to Pruett specifically. Douglas Renfrew was indicted separately on charges related to the assault on Eddie Voss and on racketeering charges connected to Iron Wolves operations. The trials ran through 1981 and 1982. Victor Pruett was convicted of racketeering and conspiracy. He was acquitted of the murder charges. The evidentiary standard for establishing his personal culpability for the deaths at the Rimrock proved, in the end, too high to meet without testimony that no one would provide. He was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison on the racketeering and conspiracy convictions. He served 12. Douglas Renfrew was convicted of assault and racketeering. He was sentenced to 11 years. He served 7. The men who had actually fired the weapons that killed Paul Sobieski, Kevin Lassiter, and Raymond were never identified in any proceeding that produced a conviction. Detective Ronald Ames, who had spent 4 years on this case by the time the trials concluded, gave a recorded statement to a Montana Journalism Project in 1983 in which he was asked whether he felt the legal outcomes had been just. He sat with the question for a long time before answering. Then he said, "Justice is what the system can actually produce, given what it has to work with. What happened to those men on that mountain? That was something else. Whether those two things ever line up perfectly. In a case like this one, I honestly cannot tell you that they do." The Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club, as it had existed from 1971 to 1978, did not survive the decade. The Rimrock had taken 3 of its founding members and wounded 7 more. The federal investigation and subsequent trials had taken Douglas Renfrew, who was imprisoned in 1982 and would not be released until 1989. The racketeering convictions had dismantled the financial infrastructure that the club had built over the course of the 1970s. And the combination of all these things had produced, in the remaining members, a fracturing of a unity and the trust that had been the club's most essential resource. By 1983, the Iron Wolves had fewer than 12 active members. By 1985, the chapter house on the south side of Great Falls had been vacated. By 1987, the club had, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist as an organized entity. Gary Lassiter, the elder of the 2 brothers, who had survived the Rimrock with a wound to his leg, sold the auto body shop in 1984 and moved to Wyoming. He did not speak publicly about the events of 1978 and, so far as anyone who knew him was aware, did not speak about them privately either. He was a man who had lost a brother in a club and a way of life in the space of a few years, and he carried that in silence for the rest of his life. Thomas Wick, Renfrew's oldest friend, the man who had moved the children to the creek bed on the morning of the Rimrock. Wick was one of the last active Iron Wolves. He maintained the club's nominal existence through the mid-1980s, holding meetings that sometimes had 4 people in attendance and sometimes had 2. He was, people who knew him said, fulfilling an obligation rather than building anything. Keeping faith with something that was already gone. He stopped in 1987. He said, to the one person he spoke to about it, that he had kept the club alive as long as he could out of loyalty to the men who were no longer there to keep it themselves. That loyalty, he said, had a natural end, that the men who deserved it were dead or in prison or gone, and that maintaining the form of something after its substance has departed is not loyalty. It is just habit. He let the habit go, The Cascade Riders Great Falls chapter fared somewhat better in the immediate aftermath of the Rimrock, in the sense that the chapter remained operational and Victor Pruett, before his imprisonment in 1982, had put in place a leadership structure that maintained a version of the organization. But the chapter never achieved the dominance in Cascade County that Pruett had sought. The territory that had belonged to the Iron Wolves did not simply transfer to the Riders in a way that Pruett had planned. Some of it went to other organizations that moved into the vacuum. Some of it simply ceased to exist as organized criminal activity, not because anyone had reformed, but because the infrastructure that supported it had been too damaged to rebuild. The Cascade Riders Great Falls chapter closed in 1991. Victor Pruett was released from federal prison in 1994. He returned to Spokane. He died in 2009 at the age of 72 of cardiac failure. His obituary did not mention Great Falls. Douglas Renfrew was released from federal prison in 1989. He was 50 years old. He came back to Montana, not to Great Falls, but to a small town called Belt, about 15 miles east, where he bought a small house and a plot of land, and lived for the rest of his life in a quiet that people who knew him described as deliberate and complete. He did not ride motorcycles after his release. He was asked about this once by a man who had known him in the Iron Wolves years, who visited him in Belt in the mid-1990s and asked, because he genuinely wanted to understand, why Renfrew no longer rode. Renfrew thought about it. Then he said, because when I was riding, I was always moving toward something. And right now I don't want to be moving toward anything. I want to be where I am. He died in 2011 at the age of 71 of lung cancer, which he had been diagnosed with 2 years earlier and which he had declined to treat in any aggressive way. He had no living family of record. Thomas Wick drove from wherever he was living by then. It took him most of a day to attend the funeral, which was small and quiet and held on a gray October morning in a cemetery outside Belt with the mountains visible in the distance. Wick said later that it was the saddest funeral he had ever attended, which, given the funerals he had attended in his life, was saying something. He deserved more people, Wick said. He deserved more than what he got in the end. Most of them did. To understand the Rimrock War in the full dimension it deserves, you have to step back from the specifics, from Renfrew and Pruett and the Highwood Mountains, and look at the larger world that made all of it possible. That larger world had several components. The first was a war. Vietnam returned approximately 2.7 million American veterans to civilian life between 1964 and 1975. It returned them with a range of experiences that civilian society was not equipped to receive, not just the physical wounds, which were visible and classifiable, but the psychological ones, which were not. The understanding of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder was, in the mid-1970s, in its infancy. Clinicians who worked with returning veterans described symptoms: intrusive memories, hypervigilance, emotional dysregulation, the sense of permanent alertness that combat imposes, and that peace cannot easily undo, that they did not yet have a unified diagnostic framework for. The veterans who struggled most were often the ones who needed help most obviously, but who were also least likely to seek it in the official channels available. Men who had been trained to see need as vulnerability, who had organized their survival around the suppression of fear and the appearance of competence, who had learned in combat that the man who admitted weakness was the man who created risk for the people around him. These men did not naturally find their way to a VA waiting room and fill out a form. They found other ways. The second component was an economy. The late 1970s were economically difficult years in the American West in ways that are sometimes obscured by the broader national narrative of the period, which focuses on energy crises and inflation and the specific middle-class anxieties of the Carter years. In communities like Great Falls, communities built around extractive industries, around the specific economic logic of taking something from the earth and processing it, the 1970s were a period of accelerating structural decline that would intensify in the 1980s and reach its culmination for many of these communities in the 1990s. The smelter in Great Falls closed permanently in 1980, eliminating what had been, for decades, the city's largest employer. The communities across the American West that experienced similar closures in the same period found themselves facing a specific kind of crisis, not just economic, but social and psychological. Communities built around a single industry lose more than jobs when that industry goes. They lose the organizing principle of daily life, the shift schedule that structured time, the physical gathering places that organize community, the shared identity of people who do the same difficult work. Into the space left by that loss, things moved, some of them constructive, some of them not. The third component was federal law enforcement's evolving relationship with outlaw motorcycle clubs. The FBI's RICO cases against motorcycle clubs in the 1970s and 1980s were part of a broader law enforcement strategy that represented, at the time, a significant tactical evolution. The understanding that criminal organizations, whether traditional organized crime, motorcycle clubs, or other structured groups, could be prosecuted as entities rather than simply as collections of individuals was a conceptual breakthrough that the RICO statute had made legally possible. The Rimrock case in this context was one of dozens of federal prosecutions of motorcycle clubs during this period that collectively reshaped the landscape of organized crime in the American West. But the evolution of law enforcement strategy also had an underside that is worth acknowledging. The aggressive prosecution of motorcycle clubs in this period swept up, along with genuine criminal enterprises, organizations that were criminal in some aspects and community building in others. The Iron Wolves, as should be clear from everything that has been said about them, were both. The federal prosecution that followed the Rimrock addressed the criminal aspects and was largely indifferent to the other aspects, which is what federal prosecution is equipped to do and what it was designed to do. But history is wider than law, and a history that only records what the law addressed will always be incomplete. The outlaw motorcycle club culture of the American West in the 1970s and 1980s was, simultaneously, a genuine brotherhood, a criminal enterprise, a response to institutional failure, and a contributor to community harm. All of these things at once, not in sequence, not in separation, but all at the same time, coexisting in the same organizations and sometimes in the same individuals. People who study this period sometimes want to resolve that complexity into something simpler. They want to say, these men were criminals, full stop. Or, these men were victims of a failed system, full stop. The truth is resistant to both framings, because the truth is that these men were human beings operating in the specific circumstances they found themselves in, making the choices available to them, being shaped by forces larger than themselves while also being responsible for what they chose. That is the most honest account of them that exists. And honest accounts of complicated people in complicated situations are, in the long run, the most useful ones. Not because they make us feel better, they often don't, but because they give us more to work with when we try to understand how to prevent the same things from happening in the same ways again. The history of outlaw motorcycle clubs is almost always told as a story about men. This is partly accurate. The clubs were male organizations, their membership and leadership entirely male, their culture built around specifically masculine frameworks of loyalty and dominance and brotherhood. But it is not entirely accurate, because the world around those clubs included women whose experience of what happened was real and significant and almost entirely absent from the official record. The women connected to the Iron Wolves, wives, partners, the sisters and mothers and daughters who existed in proximity to the organization, experienced the years of escalation and the Rimrock and the trials and the aftermath in ways that have been very rarely documented and deserve more attention than they typically receive. Darlene Lassiter was Gary Lassiter's wife and Kevin Lassiter's sister-in-law. She had been married to Gary since 1969. She had 2 children by 1978, a daughter age 7 and a son age 5. She was not at the Rimrock. Women did not typically come on a 4th of July ride. It was, by tradition, a men's event. She was in Great Falls on the morning of July 3rd, when her husband called from a payphone somewhere on the highway coming back from the mountains. She said later that she knew from the sound of his voice before he said anything that something had happened. That the specific quality of Gary's voice in that call, flat, controlled, holding something enormous behind the flatness, told her everything she needed to know before the words came. The words came. Kevin was dead. She said that the next several hours were the worst of her life. Not just the grief, which was real and immediate, but the specific grief of a woman who could not publicly mourn in the way that grief requires mourning. Kevin's death was part of something that the community she lived in did not know how to hold with sympathy. The official response was investigation and prosecution. The unofficial community response was the ambivalent looking away that Great Falls had been practicing for years. There was no space in which Darlene Lassiter could simply grieve the death of her brother-in-law, without the grief being complicated by everything surrounding it. She managed because she had 2 children who needed her to manage, and because Gary needed her, and because women in these situations have been managing under impossible conditions for as long as these situations have existed. She left Great Falls with Gary in 1984. She has not spoken publicly about those years. There were children at the Rimrock. This has been mentioned, but it deserves more than a mention. For children between 6 and 12 years old were at the Rimrock camp on the morning of July 3rd, 1978. They were there because their fathers had brought them to what had always been, in their experience, a safe and joyful event. 3 days in the mountains with the people their fathers were closest to, an adventure, a memory in the making. What they experienced instead was something else entirely. Thomas Wick moved the children to the creek bed as soon as the attack began. This was, by every account, the right decision and a brave one, made in real time under extreme conditions. The children were not in the line of fire during the engagement. They were physically unharmed, but they were there. They heard it. They were 12 years old and 10 years old and 8 years old and 6 years old, and they were crouched in a Montana Creek bed, while men were dying 30 yards away. The oldest of them is in his late 50s now. What those children experienced that morning, and how they made sense of it over the years that followed, that is a story that has never been told, and probably never will be, because the people who could tell it have chosen not to. That choice deserves to be respected, but the experience deserves to be acknowledged, because it too is part of what happened at the Rimrock. The dead are not the only ones who were changed by it. Thomas Wick was the last surviving member of the original 7 Iron Wolves. He is, as of the recording of this account, still alive. He is in his mid-80s. He lives in western Montana, in a small town in the Clark Fork River Valley, in a house he has lived in since the early 1990s. He does not give interviews. He has made one exception to this rule in the mid-2000s for a journalist who had spent 3 years earning his trust, and even that interview was partial. He spoke about certain things and would not speak about others, and the things he would not speak about were the things a journalist most wanted to know. What he did speak about: the founding of the club, the early years, the character of the men who built it with him. He spoke about with a specificity and a feeling that made clear he had been living with these memories for decades and had organized them into a narrative that he carried the way people carry things that are too heavy to set down and too important to drop. He spoke about Douglas Renfrew with a specific love of a man who has known someone since childhood, the love that includes full knowledge of the person's failures and contradictions, that has survived arguments and betrayals and long silences, that is not romantic or idealized, but is somehow deeper for being none of those things. He said, Doug built something that mattered. The thing it became, not all of it was what he intended, but what he was trying to build at the beginning. That was real. I know it was real because I was there. I know what it felt like, and I know how rare it is to feel that, to feel like you belong somewhere, to feel like the people around you will not leave you to manage alone. He paused. Then he said, we didn't manage to keep it, but we built it, and I think that matters. I think that counts for something, even given everything else. He would not say what he thought it counted toward, or what kind of accounting he imagined it would appear in. He just said it mattered. And perhaps, in the end, that is the most anyone can say about a thing that was both real and broken at the same time, that it mattered, that the people who built it believed in it, that the believing was genuine even when the thing itself was not what it claimed to be, that the men who gave their lives to it, not just Paul Sobieski and Kevin Lassiter and Raymond Flood, who gave their lives in the most literal sense, but all of them, Renfrew and Wick and the Lassiters and Flood and Sobieski, and even Eddie Voss, that all of them were trying, in the specific and limited ways available to them, to find something worth belonging to, that they were wrong about some of the ways they went about finding it as true, that they were not wrong to be looking as also true. Both of those things can be held at the same time. Thomas Wick did not ride motorcycles after the 1980s. His reasons for this he has not explained. People who know him say that he drives an old pickup truck and that he keeps to himself, and that he is, in his 80s, a man at peace with something that it took him a long time to make peace with. What that thing is, he has not said. But peace, when it comes to a man who has lived through what Thomas Wick has lived through, is not a small thing. It is not a small thing at all. Paul Sobieski was 41 years old when he died at the Rimrock. He had been a mechanic, not just with the club. He had been a mechanic all his working life. The kind of man who understood machines the way other people understand language, intuitively, from the inside. He had a shop on the south side of Great Falls where he did work for anyone who brought it to him, club business and civilian business both, without distinction. People said he was the kind of mechanic you could trust, which in a profession full of people you couldn't trust was a reputation worth having. He had never married. He had a sister in Billings who drove to Great Falls for the funeral and who, in the years after, occasionally spoke to journalists and investigators who were trying to piece together the history of the Iron Wolves. She spoke about her brother with the specific love that siblings who knew each other well and have lost each other young speak with, the love that remembers the person whole, not just a person as they appear in a story about something terrible. She said Paul liked jazz, had played harmonica badly and enthusiastically, had been, away from the club, a quiet man who cooked well and kept a garden. She said, people read about what happened and they see the patch and they see how he died, and they think they understand who he was. They don't understand it all. Kevin Lassiter was 34 years old. He and his brother Gary had been close in the way brothers who are also business partners, and also, since the founding of the Iron Wolves, brothers in the organizational sense can be close, which is to say very close, and also complicated, because so many of the lines of relationship in their lives ran parallel and sometimes tangled. Gary Lassiter, who survived the Rimrock and who sold the business and left the state in 1984, said only one thing about his brother in a conversation he reluctantly agreed to many years later. He said, Kevin was the better of us, of the two of us, and I'm the one who's still here. I've been trying to figure out what to do with that for 40 years. He had no answer to provide. Kevin Lassiter was buried in a cemetery in Great Falls. His grave marker has his name and his dates and nothing else. No epitaph. Gary Lassiter, when asked about the absence, said that he had not been able to find words that seemed adequate and had decided that inadequate words were worse than none. Raymond Flood was 43 years old. He was the one who had worked the smelter, the one who had decided, years before the Rimrock, that the world could not surprise him. He was, people said, the most self-contained member of the original seven, the one least given to the camaraderie that the club ran on, though he was loyal to in his way, loyal in the deep and quiet way of people who do not wear what they feel on the outside. He had a daughter. She was 17 years old when her father died at the Rimrock. Her mother had not been part of the Iron Wolves world, had been, for most of Raymond Flood's club years, removed from it by a separation that had been quiet and without drama, the separation of two people who had been wrong for each other in the slow, grinding way rather than the sudden explosive way. His daughter visited Great Falls as an adult, many years after the Rimrock, and went to the cemetery where her father was buried. She stood there for a while in the way that people stand at graves they don't know how to be at, then left. She was asked afterward what she had felt. She said, mostly I felt that I didn't know him, and now I never will. And I don't know if that's the saddest part of this whole thing or just a part of it. The Highwood Mountains rise in Cascade County, east of Great Falls, as they always have. The sandstone cliffs that give the Rimrock its name are still there. The creek below them still runs cold in July. Cold in the way that mountain creeks are cold even in high summer, fed by snowmelt from higher elevations. The pines on the slope are older than they were in 1978, broader, taller, filling in spaces that were open then. The flat ground below the cliffs where the Iron Wolves made their camp for 7 summers is still there. There is nothing there to indicate what happened on the morning of July 3rd, 1978. No marker, no memorial, no official acknowledgement of any kind. The campsite is used by hunters in the fall and by occasional hikers in summer, and most of them know nothing of its history. Montana has a particular relationship with its violent history, a state built essentially on displacement and extraction, the displacement of indigenous people, the extraction of minerals and timber and grass, Montana has always had violence in its past and has always been ambivalent about what to do with the memory of it. Certain violences are commemorated. Others are absorbed into the landscape, become part of the texture of a place without being named. The Rimrock War is one of the latter. In Great Falls, people of a certain age remember it. Remember it the way you remember things that happened when you were young and that seemed enormous at the time. Enormous and also somehow inevitable. The way things that happen in a particular place and a particular time feel inevitable in retrospect, even when they were not. The generation that came after knows less, knows the outlines sometimes, if they grew up in a family connected to either club, or they happened to read a piece of local journalism that touched on the history. But the specifics, the names, the dates, the particular shape of what was built and what was lost, those specifics have not been preserved in any public way. Detective Ronald Ames retired from the Cascade County Sheriff's Department in 1992, having spent 14 years in the Detective Division, and a significant portion of that time working cases connected, directly or indirectly, to the motorcycle club conflict. He moved to a small town in the western part of the state after his retirement. He died in 2018. In his retirement, Ames occasionally spoke to researchers and journalists interested in the Iron Wolves case. He was consistent across all of these conversations in his assessment of what had happened and what it meant. He said that the Rimrock was a predictable result of a set of conditions that nobody with the authority to change them had changed in time. That two groups of men with real histories, real grievances, real reasons for being what they were, had been allowed to escalate toward a collision that a more attentive system might have interrupted at any of several points. He said this not to excuse anyone. He was careful to clarify, not to argue that what happened at the Rimrock was anyone's fault but the people who were there. But he said that the world that produced the Iron Wolves, that produced Vietnam veterans returning to an economy that didn't want them, with wounds the system didn't know how to treat, building the only functional community available to them in the only way that felt honest, that world had things to answer for too. 5 men died on that mountain. Ames said in one of his final recorded conversations on the subject. 5 men. And every single one of them had reasons, real reasons, for being where they were and doing what they were doing. None of them started out to end up there. That's the thing people forget. Nobody starts out to end up in the worst moment of their life. They just keep making the next decision and the next decision, and eventually the decisions have taken them somewhere they can't walk back from. He paused. And by the time you see where you are, he said, it's already too late to choose different. There's a grave in a Great Falls cemetery with a gray wolf's head carved into the stone above the name. It is Paul Sobieski's grave. His sister chose the marker. She said, when asked about it, that whatever the Iron Wolves had become, Paul had been part of it because it had given him something he needed, and that she was not going to pretend otherwise or sanitize his memory into something more comfortable. He found his people, she said. They were the wrong people, maybe by the end, but they were his people, and he died with them. And I think he would have said that mattered. The Highwood Mountains rise in the morning light east of Great Falls. The Rimrock catches the sun in the early hours and holds it, the sandstone going warm gold before the valley below has fully woken up. The creek runs. The pines move in the wind off the higher elevations. In July, sometimes, the camp below the cliffs is empty, and in the silence of the early morning, before the hunters or the hikers arrive, before the day fills up with the sound that days fill up with, there's just the wind and the water and the mountains that saw it, the mountains that remember, the way Montana always remembers, not loudly, not publicly, but deeply, in the way that stone remembers pressure and water remembers the shape of its bed, and the soil of a campfire ring remembers heat. The mountains remember, and somewhere in that cold morning air above the Rimrock, if you stand still enough and listen carefully enough, 5 men are still riding. The Iron Wolves, the Cascade Riders, Cascade County, Montana, 1978. 5 dead, 2 clubs destroyed. 1 mountain that remembers everything. Every story about violence is, underneath the violence, a story about something else. The Rimrock War is, underneath its violence, a story about belonging, about what human beings will build when the official structures available to them fail, to provide the thing that every human being requires: the sense of being known, of being part of something larger than themselves, of having people who will not let them face the darkness alone. The men who built the Iron Wolves were not primarily building a criminal enterprise. The criminal enterprise was something the organization became incrementally under the pressure of its own internal logic and the economic realities of operating in the world. What they were primarily building was a place to belong, a place where the things that had been done to them in Vietnam, in the economy, in the indifferent machinery of society that had used them and then looked the other way, could be acknowledged among people who understood without explanation. This does not excuse the criminal enterprise. The stolen goods and the drugs and the enforcement work and all of it, those cause real harm to real people, and that harm does not become acceptable because the organization causing it was also providing community to its members. But the accounting is incomplete if it only includes a harm. The men who built the Cascade Riders were building something similar, though shaped differently, shaped by different origins, by Victor Pruett's particular experiences and the organization's history in Portland and the Pacific Northwest. They, too, were building structure and brotherhood, and a place that operated according to rules they understood and could master in ways the outside world did not offer them. They also caused harm, real harm. The rimrock was their violence, their planning, their men coming down a Montana mountain in the early morning to attack people at a campsite. That, too, is part of the accounting and cannot be omitted. But the accounting is also incomplete if it does not include what drove them there, what drove all of them there, what Vietnam did and what the economy did, and what a society does when it produces men it doesn't know what to do with and then looks away. 0.5 men died at the rimrock. Paul Sobieski, Kevin Lassiter, Raymond Flood, two Cascade Riders whose names appear in court records and are not reproduced here because their families have asked that they not be, a request that has been honored. 5 men, 5 lives, 5 sets of people who loved them and lost them and had to find ways to continue. That is the weight of it. That is what the legal proceedings and the club histories and the investigative files and all the rest of it ultimately comes down to. 5 people who were alive on the morning of July 2nd and were not alive on the morning of July 4th, and the ripples of that absence extending outward through time, touching people and places and moments that the 5 men themselves never reached. Paul Sobieski never heard the jazz albums released after 1978, never grew the garden beyond the summer of that year. Kevin Lassiter never had children, though Gary said he had wanted them. Raymond Flood never told his daughter whatever it was that he had decided, at some point in those last quiet years, that he might eventually tell her. These are small losses, measured against the scale of events, but they are also everything, because a life is not a sum of its large moments. It is the accumulated weight of all the small ones, the records and the gardens and the conversations that never happened because the person who would have had them stopped existing on a mountain in Montana in July of 1978. The Highwood Mountains are still there. The rimrock is still there. The creek still runs cold to the camp where the Iron Wolves made their fires for 7 summers, where children ran the water in the afternoons, where men who had come back from war found, for 3 days a year, something that approximated what peace might feel like. The mountains don't care about any of it. That is what mountains are for. They don't care. They simply stand. They hold the sky. They are there when the people who need to look at something large and stable and permanent need something to look at. They were there before Douglas Renfrew was born. They will be there long after the last person who remembers his name is gone. And in the meantime, in the narrow, specific, temporary, human meantime, the story of what happened among them matters. It matters because Paul Sobieski mattered, because Kevin Lassiter mattered, because Raymond Flood mattered, because even Eddie Voss, who broke something that couldn't be fixed, who lived with that knowledge for the rest of his life and tried, in his last years, to make himself into something different. Even he mattered, because the children in the creek bed mattered, because Darlene Lassiter, grieving in a city that didn't know how to hold her grief, mattered, because Thomas Wick, who said yes in 1971 and has been saying various forms of yes ever since, carrying the weight of it into his 80s in a house by a river in western Montana. He matters. They all matter. And that is why we tell these stories. Not to celebrate the violence, not to glamorize the organizations or the choices or the outcomes, but because the people were real And real people deserve to be accounted for. And the accounting, the full accounting, the one that includes the harm they caused and the community they built and the war that made them and the economy that failed them and the system that was not adequate to receive them. That accounting is the only honest response to lives that were this complicated. The Iron Wolves, the Cascade Riders. Cascade County, Montana. 1978. 5 dead. 2 clubs destroyed. A city that looked away and then couldn't. And somewhere in the Highwood Mountains, in the early morning, before anything else is moving, just the creek, just the pines, just a cold, patient, enormous, indifferent Montana sky.